The sound of breaking glass shattered the Los Angeles night as 14-year-old Steve McQueen realized that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're too small to win. In a cramped apartment where fear had been the only law for months, a scrawny kid with ice blue eyes was about to discover that courage isn't about size. It's about refusing to watch the people you love get destroyed by monsters who mistake cruelty for strength. Tonight, a victim would become a warrior. Tonight, authority would meet rebellion. Tonight, Steve McQueen would be born. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy, 1944, Los Angeles, California. A narrow apartment on the wrong side of everything, where broken dreams collected like dust in corners that never saw sunlight. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors fighting, the floors creaked with every step, and the air always carried the smell of cooking grease mixed with desperation. This wasn't poverty. This was survival disguised as living. Julian McQueen, 32 years old, moved through her own home like a ghost afraid of disturbing the living. Once beautiful, now worn down by circumstances that had stolen her confidence and replaced it with constant fear. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow made her look over her shoulder. Every day was measured by how successfully she could avoid triggering the rage that had become the defining characteristic of her household. Victor Berle, her husband, filled the small apartment with presence that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the kind of menace that comes from men who've learned to control through fear rather than respect. An alcoholic who measured his worth by how effectively he could diminish everyone around him, he ruled through unpredictable violence that kept his family walking on eggshells that cracked under the weight of their own anxiety. Steve McQueen, 14 years old, sat in the corner watching it all with eyes that had already seen too much. Reform schools had taught him about institutional cruelty, but this was personal in ways that made official punishment seem almost merciful by comparison. At least reform school guards went home at night. Victor Berle was always there, always watching, always looking for reasons to remind everyone who held the power in this house, built on fear. Steve was small for his age, all sharp angles and nervous energy, but something burned behind those pale blue eyes that was older than his years and more dangerous than his size suggested. The reform schools hadn't broken him. They'd taught him that authority without justice was just organized bullying, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to make them afraid of you instead. For months, he'd watched his mother shrink under Victor's casual cruelty, watched her apologize for existing, watched her try to become invisible in her own home. Every day the rage built like pressure in a boiler with no release valve, until Steve understood that something had to give before everything exploded. Tonight was that night. The apartment's single bedroom served as Victor's command center, where he held court with his bottle of cheap whiskey and his collection of grievances against a world that had never given him the respect he felt he deserved. The kitchen was neutral territory where meals were prepared in silence and consumed without conversation, but the narrow hallway between them was no man's land, where confrontations happened and damage was assessed. "Julian!" Victor's voice cut through the evening quiet, like a blade through silk. "Where's my goddamn dinner?" The words carried undertones that made Steve's hands clench into fists. Not hunger, but an excuse to demonstrate power. Not a request, but a test to see how quickly his wife would scramble to please him. "It's almost ready, Victor. Just a few more minutes." "Few more minutes? I've been working all day while you've been sitting around this apartment doing nothing. Least you could do is have food ready when I want it." Steve watched his mother's shoulders tense as she stirred something on the stove with movements that were too careful, too controlled. She was trying to make herself smaller, trying to avoid giving Victor any reason to escalate from verbal abuse to something worse. "I'm sorry. It'll be ready in just..." The sound of Victor's chair scraping against the floor interrupted her apology. Heavy footsteps on creaking floorboards, moving from the bedroom toward the kitchen with purpose that made Steve's stomach clench with familiar dread. Sorry isn't dinner on the table. Sorry isn't what I work for. Sorry is what useless women say when they can't handle simple responsibilities. Victor appeared in the kitchen doorway, filling the frame with bulk that seemed larger in the cramped space. His face was flushed with alcohol and the kind of anger that came from men who blamed everyone else for their own failures. Victor, please, just give me 2 minutes and 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Always an excuse with you. Always some reason why you can't do the one thing I ask. Steve rose from his corner chair without conscious decision. Something in Victor's tone, something in his mother's frightened posture, something in the way the air itself seemed to thicken with approaching violence. She's making dinner, Steve said quietly. Food takes time to cook. Victor's attention shifted like a predator noticing unexpected movement. Those bloodshot eyes fixed on Steve with interest that carried no warmth and considerable malice. Nobody asked you anything, boy. This is between adults. She's my mother. She's my wife. And this is my house. You don't like how things work here, there's always the reform school. They seem to enjoy having you. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, carrying implications that went beyond temporary punishment to permanent exile. Victor had used Steve's past against him before, reminding him that unwanted children had limited options and fewer rights. Victor, leave him alone, Julian whispered. He's just what? Just a smart-mouth kid who thinks he can interfere in grown-up business? Just another mouth to feed who doesn't contribute anything useful to this household? Victor took a step toward Steve, close enough that the smell of whiskey and stale cigarettes became overwhelming. Close enough that Steve could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes, the cruel satisfaction in his expression. Maybe it's time you learned some respect for the man who puts a roof over your head. The first shove was almost casual, designed to humiliate rather than seriously harm. Just enough force to send Steve stumbling backward, off balance but not down. A demonstration of power difference, a reminder of who controlled physical space in this apartment. Victor, don't, Julian pleaded, moving between them with desperate courage that came from maternal instinct overriding personal fear. He's just a child. Child needs to learn his place. The second shove was harder, meant to put Steve on the floor where Victor could loom over him like a giant demonstrating superiority to an insect. But Steve had learned balance in reform school playgrounds where bigger boys used size as their primary weapon, had learned to absorb impact and recover quickly. He stayed on his feet. That the best you got? Steve asked, his voice carrying none of the fear Victor expected and all of the contempt Victor couldn't tolerate. The change in Victor's expression was instantaneous and terrifying. Casual bullying transformed into genuine rage, the kind that ended with someone getting seriously hurt. His hand drew back in a fist that would do damage to a grown man, let alone a 14-year-old kid. But the fist wasn't aimed at Steve. It was aimed at Julian, who had made the mistake of trying to protect her son from consequences she understood better than he did. Bitch thinks she can tell me what to do in my own house. Time slowed to individual frames like a movie projector running at wrong speed. Steve watched the fist travel toward his mother's face, watched her eyes widen with fear and resignation, watched her try to turn away from impact she knew she couldn't avoid. Something snapped inside Steve's chest like a wire stretched beyond its breaking point. He moved without thinking, without planning, without considering consequences or calculating odds. Pure instinct born from months of suppressed rage, and the sudden understanding that some things were worth any risk. Steve grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it at Victor's head with every ounce of strength his thin arms could generate. The impact made a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, wet and solid and final. Victor's forward momentum stopped like he'd run into a brick wall, his eyes going wide with shock and pain before rolling back to show white. He dropped to the kitchen floor like a sack of grain, blood flowing from a scalp wound that would require stitches if he was lucky, and surgery if he wasn't. Silence filled the apartment like water filling a sinking ship, complete and crushing, and somehow louder than any noise. Steve stood over Victor's motionless body, still holding the skillet, chest heaving with adrenaline, and the realization that he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Steve," his mother whispered, "what have you done? What needed doing?" Victor groaned and tried to push himself up on his elbows, blood streaming down his face, expression changing from shock to homicidal fury as he processed what had happened. "You little bastard, I'm gonna kill you for that." But when he tried to stand, Steve was already moving again. This time with the kitchen chair swinging it down on Victor's back with mechanical precision that suggested this wasn't panic but calculated violence applied with surgical accuracy. Victor collapsed again, this time staying down, breathing hard but no longer trying to get up. "You move toward her again," Steve said, his voice carrying none of the high pitch of adolescence and all of the cold certainty of someone who'd just discovered his own capacity for necessary violence. "And I'll kill you." The words weren't spoken as threat or boast. They were delivered like a weather report, factual and inevitable, and completely without emotion. Victor looked up at the skinny kid standing over him with blood on his hands and death in his eyes, and for the first time in his adult life, he experienced genuine fear of someone smaller than himself. "You can't, you're just a kid. Kid who just put you on the floor. Kid who'll put you in the ground if you give me reason." Steve set the chair down and turned to his mother, who was staring at him with expression that mixed relief with terror. She'd been saved, but by someone she no longer completely recognized. "Pack your things, Mom. We're leaving." "Steve, we can't just—" "We can and we will. Tonight, now." He looked down at Victor, who was trying to stop the bleeding with a dish towel, his whole body shaking with pain and the psychological impact of being beaten by someone he'd assumed was helpless. "You call the police, tell them whatever story makes you feel better about getting beaten by a 14-year-old. But if you come looking for us, if you try to find us, if you even think about us too hard, I'll finish what I started here." Steve walked to the narrow window that looked out on streets that led everywhere and nowhere, understanding that he was about to become what he'd always been destined to be, someone who belonged to himself and answered to no one. "This is my house," Victor mumbled through split lips. "You can't throw me out of my own house." "I'm not throwing you out. I'm leaving. But if you're smart, you'll be gone before we come back for the rest of Mom's things." Steve helped his mother gather the few possessions that mattered, moving with efficiency that suggested he'd always known this moment would come and had been preparing for it subconsciously. As they reached the door, Victor made one final attempt to reassert authority through the only method he understood. "Julian, you walk out that door with him, don't bother coming back. You'll have nothing, nowhere to go, nobody to take care of you." Steve turned around one last time, fixing Victor with those pale blue eyes that would become famous for their ability to communicate deadly intent without saying a word. "She's got me, and I just proved that's enough." They walked out into the Los Angeles night, leaving behind the apartment where fear had ruled, and carrying with them the understanding that some chains could only be broken through violence that served justice rather than cruelty. Steve McQueen, 14 years old, had just learned the most important lesson of his life. Authority without righteousness was just organized bullying, and the only way to stop a bully was to make them more afraid of you than you were of them. He would never again bow to anyone who tried to control him through fear. He would never again watch injustice happen when he had the power to stop it. He would never again be the victim in his own story. The boy who walked into that apartment had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. The young man who walked out had been forged by fire into someone who would spend the rest of his life refusing to let anyone else define his worth or dictate his choices. Years later, when reporters asked Steve McQueen about his legendary rebelliousness, his refusal to compromise with studio executives, his insistence on doing his own stunts regardless of insurance concerns, they were seeing the direct result of that night in 1944, when a scared kid decided that some things were worth any risk. The anti-authority attitude that would make him famous, the ice-cold stare that would terrify screen villains, the absolute refusal to back down from anyone or anything. All of it could be traced back to a cramped Los Angeles apartment where a boy became a man by refusing to let evil win through superior size. That night, Steve McQueen learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and acting anyway when the people you loved needed protection. It was about understanding that some fights choose you, and when they do, the only honorable response is to fight back with everything you have. The sound of breaking glass had started it all. But what ended in that kitchen was the creation of a legend who would spend the rest of his life proving that nobody had the right to make anyone else live in fear. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.